Evening. Getting dark pretty quick. Welcome and thank you for coming. This is the third seminar in the Democratic Marxism series, and in this case, public lecture. We are building on a theme that we engaged with last month on the climate crisis. That was related to also a book that we launched. And this time around, we were grappling with this big problem, this dangerous contradiction of the climate crisis through the analytic of transnational class analysis and trying to locate where fossil capital is and who's really driving fossil capital today and what does this mean for climate justice politics. And I must also add that just in terms of the kind of analytic we brought to class analysis, it was really, really exciting. This was about drawing on metadata. This was about mapping exactly where, if you like, fossil capital is located, the interlocks, ownership, board level interlocks, etc. And leading this conversation with two very, very, if you like, accomplished sociologists in this field. William Carroll from the University of Victoria and J.P. Sapinski. And welcome to both of you. JP, where are you? Yes. We spent our time over the past 3 days really working through this mode of analysis and trying to think about how it could inform strategy, tactic, the just transition, and so on. But Bill has been at this for a long time. He's written several books on the Canadian social formation, or Canadian capitalism. In the early 80s, he was one of the, if you like, pioneers in this field, building on Domhoff and others' work around the power structure and elites, and really trying to pin down another way of thinking about class in structural and agential terms. And Bill's work has really evolved to the point where he is one of the leading transnational class analysts in the world, using this way of thinking about class. And he has a great book on this, and it's on my phone, all the titles, but he has a great book on this, on transnational classes. It's very much informed by a Marxian Gramscian take on class formation, the transnational class, and how it comes together at different levels, ideologically and politically and so on, and the capacities that it builds. Bill also has done a lot of work around thinking through corporate mapping. And he's been able to set up a project in the Canadian context. Canada is one of our leading carbon criminal states in the world. And the corporate mapping project that Bill leads brings together a network of universities, academics, activist scholars, movements, etc. to again map carbon capital in the Canadian context and to think through strategies and tactics. And JP is also a big part of that, and they are doing cutting-edge, path-breaking work, and I'm hoping tonight we also get a feel for some of that work. And then one of the other areas of Bill's work has been mapping, if you like, counter-hegemonic structures, transnational policy groups that are building capacities, working with movements, not in a kind of NGOized way, not in a top-down, instrumentalized way, but in a way that's really thinking with, building capacities with, and breaking ground together. And he also has a great book on that, mapping the leading, I think, 12 transnational policy groups in the world that are articulating alternatives, etc. So those of you who are interested in think tanks, alternative think tanks, Bill is actually the person on the left to have a conversation with. In the 80s, we saw a ballooning of right-wing think tanks in the world. And this is, if you like, the counter-power that Bill is really trying to understand and bring into our political imagination and practice. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Bill to walk us through transnational class analysis, fossil capital, and climate justice struggles. Over to you, Bill.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Vish, for that very generous introduction. Yes, so I'm very pleased to be here and to be part of this event. I guess the lecturer, the designated speaker. And what I want to do is, as Vish was saying, is to walk us through a number of issues that are interrelated and very challenging. So I simply find it very challenging, and I'm looking forward to any comments that people have. But let me get right into the presentation itself and just try to acclimatize myself to this particular technology. And where I want to start is by talking a little bit about climate justice as a term that really is just a dozen years old. And it's a very important term. It's an important kind of visionary term, right? Climate justice. And in the past decade, it's gained some visibility in mass politics, in strategically focused direct actions, and in various contexts. And yet the world, as we know, continues on its death march to catastrophic climate change. We are already experiencing dramatic increases in extreme weather, polar ice melt, methane discharge from thawing tundra, and ocean acidification, and decreases in biodiversity. Obstructing the changes needed to salvage human communities is the power of capital, wielded at different scales and in different contexts. And in this lecture, what I want to do is try to situate climate struggles in the broad context of transnational class formation within the political economy of fossil capital. So it's a big undertaking, and no doubt what I have to say would be very incomplete, but let me take a stab at it. So let me begin by laying out a framework within which we can understand class formation as a complex process in what Gramsci called historical blocks being brought into being. And within historical materialism, class formation has been envisaged both as a structural process tied to modes of production, if you like, and as an agentic assemblage of practices and relations that serve as the premises and the results of class struggle. So it's both agency and structure. And in trying to think about how they maybe fit together, I've turned to a theory of social movements by Alf Nielsen. And he says, social movements emanate from and are grounded in the collective, skilled activity of both dominant and subaltern groups. The advantage of that conceptualization is that we can recognize that there are movements from above, not just movements from below. Neoliberalism is a movement from above. And these movements from above strive to maintain or modify a dominant structure in ways that reproduce or extend the power of dominant groups and their hegemonic position within the social formation. Now, on the other hand, there are movements from below, as we know. That's what we usually think of when we think of a movement. And movements from below pursue an alternative project, maybe a project of reform, it may be a more radical project of transformation. Now, if we think about class formation, in terms of agency especially, class formation involves the formation of movements from above and from below. And it's in these movements that that a structurally defined class in itself, like say a group of investors, becomes a class for itself, a kind of transnational capitalist class for itself, capable of articulating and pursuing its collective interests. The struggle between simply replicating the past, maintaining business as usual, including the creative destruction that is integral to capital accumulation. So the struggle between replicating the past and opening alternative futures is at the center of class formation and class struggle. Within the climate emergency that we're living now, class formation from above involves the protection of revenue streams, the delay of changes that might threaten profits, the assimilation of mitigating and post-carbon technologies and practices under the sway of capital. In these circumstances, class formation from below must embrace the struggle for a post-capitalist, post-carbon way of life. And I think contemporary movements for climate justice comprise the leading edge of this struggle. So my own studies of class formation have leaned on Gramsci's account of hegemony, counter-hegemony, and the role of intellectuals. Now, in this perspective, as integral to its own being, each fundamental group or class creates organic intellectuals. And these are organizers of a way of life, as Gramsci put it, who provide leadership in economic, cultural, and political domains. So there's a lot of different kinds of organic intellectuals, but they're basically organizing life, and they're not necessarily capitalists or wage workers, but they're very important in the process of class formation, because this leadership is crucial, not only to the functioning of institutions, but to the conduct of social movements from above and from below. So basically, what makes a social formation, social formation transnational? What makes class formation transnational are practices that cross state borders, but do not originate with state actors. And of course, we think of transnational corporations as involved in these transnational practices, but there are also transnational movement practices that we need to cultivate and certainly pay attention to. Networked across national spaces and issue domains, these practices are what really hold together historical blocks. And the historical block might be a block that is really supporting and reproducing neoliberal capitalism on one side, but there's also the possibility of democratic globalization on the other side. And this contrast is captured nicely, I think, in the example of the World Economic Forum on one side and the World Social Forum on the other side. When we look at that example of these two forums, right, we can notice how sloped the playing field is to capital's advantage. After all, the World Economic Forum is an ongoing global project, well-funded, well-connected into powerful institutions, states, and corporations. It commands attention, right? Every year at Davos, the global elite meets and basically decides all sorts of things. Now, a few weeks ago, of course, we had Donald Trump at the World Economic Forum, and even a right-wing populist bull in the neoliberal China shop like him can be accommodated, perhaps. But the World Social Forum, we pursue the contrast, is permanently precarious and fledgling. It's beset with dilemmas, easily dismissed and marginalized. In the past 2 decades, my research program has focused, as Visha suggested, on both sides of these complex processes of class formation from above and from below, and increasingly on fossil capital and climate justice struggles as focal issues. Now, as this example shows, World Economic Forum, World Social Forum, in the process of class formation, capital holds the strong suit. Most obviously in the control of economic resources, including labor, and thus the future, as the future very much is shaped by who controls the present and economic resources of that present. And in its multifaceted but largely convivial relationship with state power, capital holds that strong suit. Perhaps less obviously, capital's strategic advantages include the following. My slides are completely mixed up. Anyway, what I want to do is walk you through 3 particular examples or instances of the strategic advantages that capital enjoys in class formation from above. And the first one is in the logic of collective action. You think about, what brings people together, how can they move collectively? The interests of capitalists are transparent, and it can be easily represented as the general interest. The interest is in growth, right? And what growth really means is capital accumulation within our hegemonic framework. And profit is, of course, the system-defined goal that's attached to growth, right? Capital as abstract alienated labor, which is what capital is, consists in investments that can be quantified, liquefied, redeployed in pursuing that regnant goal of growth and profit. If you think about living labor, in contrast, living labor is concrete. It's embodied. It's under the control of discrete individuals. Workers cannot merge except through their association, their social and ethical and political commitments. in order to partly compensate for the power advantage that capital derives from the liquidity of the dead labor that it controls, the alienated labor, which workers give up ultimately, or in the first instance, at the point of production. The interests of workers are not transparent. You can't say, well, just like capitalists have an interest in profit, workers have an interest in X. No, there's no transparency there. They need to be politically constructed, along with forms of association that must be politically constructed, always in opposition to the dominant ideology of possessive individualism. So, as long as working class interests are framed in purely economic terms, working class organization and consciousness will be confined to the corporate level of trade union consciousness, as it's been called. This basic advantage has been amplified in various ways through transnational financialization, where we have capital flowing all over the place as this kind of abstract labor that is, as I say, governed by the norm of profitability. Now, a second advantage that capital has stems from its simplicity of motive. As David Teslev has said, as long as profit can be accumulated and maximized, other considerations are secondary. Really, capitalists just want to maximize profit. This is basically it. I mean, you can listen to various discourses, and you can watch the CEO of Facebook talk about the Facebook community and how he's trying to build a community when he's being grilled by Congress people. But basically, the competitive system forces capitalists to have this simplicity of motive. It's profit maximization. This gives capital great flexibility because it can form alliances of convenience with other centers of power in various ways. And these alliances can shift over time. So there's an opportunistic aspect of capitalism. There can be a shift from capital aligned with very traditional patriarchal family movements and cultures to more kind of neoliberal feminist alignment with capital. And so these alliances can shift, and this is evident in the transition in South Africa, of course, from apartheid to neoliberalism and black economic empowerment, or the shift from full-on climate denialism to green capitalism. So there's all sorts of shifts, Capital's pragmatically material project can be realized by any combination of ideologies that instill compliance in the workplace, while discouraging effective challenge to the system. So that's the basic bottom line for capital. It's forming these alliances, instilling compliance in the workplaces so that profit can be appropriated and maximized. This advantage has been accentuated with the proliferation of postmodern culture. As postmodern fragmentation and fascination become cultural dominance, divide and conquer has emerged as a hegemonic strategy, particularly in the global north. So on the one hand, we have the various style cultures that are fostered by post-Fordist niche marketing, which deter subordinated groups from constructing broader solidarities. Everybody has their own style culture. On the other hand, a semiotic implosion cleaves signifiers from reference and promotes fascination with spectacle, while weakening the appeal of collective transformative projects. Now, a third strategic advantage that capital has in our conjuncture, in our era really, is what Jody Dean has called communicative capitalism. And this also is a kind of formation, if you like, that disorganizes and diverts subaltern energies. You think about the time that people spend on Facebook. By the way, I participate in Facebook, so I'm not sort of dumping on anybody. But Facebook and other social media majors have facilitated online pseudo-communities that function as niche markets, accentuating the public sphere's fragmentation into disjointed feed bubbles and echo chambers, and creating a regime of control, as Jody Dean calls it, stoked by the circulation of affect and emotion, in which people willingly and happily report on their views and activities and stalk their friends. Now, given such advantages for capital, class formation from below is fraught. It's difficult. Subaltern consciousness is contradictory and fragmented, founded initially through militant particularisms, framed along singular issues and identities rooted in social production and reproduction. This is a very difficult project, finding common ground, connecting the dots between forms of oppression that may on the surface appear in the immediate situation quite disparate and even at odds with each other. If Marx wrote in the Grundrisse, capital is the economic power that dominates everything in bourgeois society, how against this ubiquitous power can such disparate strata make common cause without reproducing other injustices? But the challenges multiply as we move to the level of transnational class formation from below. And here again, the World Social Forum is a very instructive case. Founded as an open space for wide-ranging discussion of alternatives to neoliberal globalization, the World Social Forum has faced the dilemma of remaining a talking shop or transforming itself into something resembling some kind of political party. It's been unable to transition from talk to action very effectively. The World Social Forum's loss of momentum is symptomatic of the left's failure to really articulate with traction a post-carbon alternative to neoliberalism, particularly after the financial collapse of 2008. Indeed, Trumpism and related developments in authoritarian populism are a reaction to neoliberalism's success in opening markets around the world, which is only a failure when judged in terms of human need. So I think Walter Benjamin's observation, every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution, speaks precisely to our current condition. And yet the phenomenon of Trump also shows that capitalism faces serious challenges to its global governance regime, as neoliberal ultra-imperialism struggles with intensifying inter-imperialist rivalry. And behind all this lie neoliberalism's continuing malaise, including the instability of financialized capitalism, and last but not least, the climate crisis. Now, turning to the last of these big issues, let me begin with the obvious, which I think I can, if I can get my slides to work here, I can, yes, begin with the obvious. Let me begin with the obvious, the symptoms of climate crisis. They are abundant. And we're all familiar with the hockey stick graph that plots global mean temperature estimates over the most recent millennium, showing an exponential increase that coincides with the Industrial Revolution. Now, just a few carbon majors, major corporations like ExxonMobil and BP, are responsible for the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. We take it all the way back, 2 centuries back, as Richard Heavey has shown, most of the greenhouse gas emissions are actually down to 90 carbon majors. The climate crisis is the most urgent aspect of an even wider ecological crisis, as we witness the 6th extinction and the ongoing depletion of so-called resources, leading to extreme extractivism as capital's ecological overshoot continues unabated. The crisis thus has a dual character. That is, it's both economic and ecological. But these have different dynamics. And indeed, you know, ecological crisis, I mean, economic crisis, as we know, as we can see in this, this graphic, economic crisis is, it's cyclical, right? We have a boom, we know there's going to be a bust, but we know, oh, it'll recover eventually and we'll have another boom. And there's a growth trend that's tied to the accumulation of capital, right? Gathering forces of production and so on. Though, of course, now we're in a serious problem where I don't think even this can be projected out as a straight line by any means. But the ecological crisis is a totally different crisis. It's not a cyclical crisis. It names the cumulative degeneration of the Earth's living systems. Now, in approaching these issues, we need to combine insights from political economy and political ecology. And we need to interrogate the present, asking how capital gains its power by appropriating energy flows, but also interrogate the future. How can we transition from fossil capitalism to a democratic and ecologically sane alternative? Now, from Marx's classic analysis, we can derive 4 foundational insights. First of all, in terms of class struggle, the interests of capital in appropriating new wealth as profit are opposed to the interests of labor in living well and expressing human creativity through labor. But again, those interests for labor have to be politically constructed. They're not transparent. Secondly, intercapitalist competition. Capital exists in many units, competing for a share of the surplus value generated by living labor. Intercapitalist competition presses each capitalist to reduce costs and plow back profits into expanded operations to stay in the game. Thirdly, it's a key insight that we can take from Marx. There is the tendency in capitalism, as we saw in that graph, toward endless growth. Microeconomically, this means that capital must grow or die. You know, a particular corporation has to generate profit, plow back profit, and grow in order to stay in the game. Right? So, but macroeconomically, that means that capitalism must continuously expand, commodifying and creating new markets and products. And then finally, from Marx, we can take the concept of metabolic rift. As it expands, as it colonizes and urbanizes the world, capital creates a metabolic rift between humanity, organized by capital, and the rest of nature. Now, recent work combining political economy and political ecology has built on these insights. So I want to just quickly walk us through 4 key texts that I think provide some really important ideas and analyses about fossil capitalism. And the first one is by Andreas Malm, and it's the book called Fossil Capital. It came out a couple years ago, and it shows how the development of capitalism as the globally dominant way of life has rested on carbon energy, which has been especially suited to capital and useful in the class struggle. Fossil capital empowers capital to accumulate on an extended scale, but it reduces CO2 on the same scale, leading inevitably to climate crisis. Now, this is Malm's basic analysis to boil it down from 400 pages to 50 words. Second book by Tim Mitchell has some very important insights for us. This is a book called Carbon Democracy. And Mitchell notes ironically that from the 1870s on, the age of democracy, as we sometimes call it, coincided with the age of empire. Quote, the rise of coal produced democracy at some sites and colonial domination at others. So at the core of the world system, we can see that coal mining brought workers together at a key point in the commodity chain, enhancing their power and enabling the northern working class to demand concessions that led to capitalist democracy, or carbon democracy. With the shift from coal to oil, much of the resource was in the Middle East, where colonial power and ethnic divisions advantaged capital. Oil production required fewer workers and provided fewer opportunities to disrupt smooth accumulation. And from Standard Oil right through to OPEC, monopoly power has enabled a few giant players to manage supply and ensure a steady stream of surplus profits. So that's sort of part of the political economy of the global fossil economy. Now, in an astute study of the United States as the epicenter of this way of life, carbon democracy, Matthew Huber has explored how the hegemony of carbon capital was cemented in the post-war era with the rise of suburbanized consumerism. In consumer capitalism's golden years, cars, single detached houses, and appliances energized segments of the working class, affording enormous power over machines, space, and everyday life in navigating the practices of reproduction, as Huber has put it. Gaining a privatized form of power gaining a privatized form of power as petroleum products came to saturate everyday life. So the kitchen, appliances, so on and so forth, all tied in with the fossil capital economy as it was really taking off, really developing at a quantum jump, if you like, in the post-war boom era. And within this assemblage, the individual experiences automobility as empowering power steering, right? And liberating. And the single detached house becomes a domain of personal sovereignty. So there's very powerful emotional tugs involved in this way of life that pull people into the hegemony of fossil capitalism. The long-range result has been to constrain politics within narrow limits that are focused on family, private property, and anti-collectivist sentiments, the stock and trade of neoliberalism. Even if for most people the American dream is a hoax, it continues to carry heavy affective and ideological ballast, giving the suburban consumer a stake in the endless growth of carbon-driven consumer capitalism and posing an ideological barrier, particularly in the global north, to movements for climate justice. Now, the fourth text is by Jason Moore, and as he observes, capital has always boosted its profitability by appropriating cheap nature. For capital, nature has served as both a tap and sink. From sugarcane in 19th century Natal to coal mine from the eco deposits of contemporary South Africa, business has tapped nature's bounty. At the same time, nature has been a sink, absorbing capital's waste. When capital claimed only a small part of the planet, these ecologically destructive tendencies had only local consequences. But with full-fledged globalization in the late 20th century, and the closing of resource frontiers, the sink overflows with greenhouse gases and other pollutants, and the tap begins to run dry, not only in declining agricultural productivity or cheap food, but in the depletion of high-grade oil. The latter provokes resort to extreme carbon, carrying greater emissions and ecological risk, and the treadmill of production spins out of control. Now, although fossil capital, large corporations that are invested in various kinds of carbon extraction, although fossil capital spent years orchestrating a climate denial campaign, most famously ExxonMobil, while its own scientists documented the link between carbon emissions and global warming, industry and its enablers and allies have more recently, and with some reluctance, embraced climate capitalism. Within this framework, solutions to the climate crisis comprise new green accumulation strategies that seem to address the climate crisis, but are unequal to the challenge. These false solutions comprise a repertoire of new denialism. In this new denialism, as my colleagues Seth Klein and Shannon Dodd put it, the fossil fuel industry and our political leaders assure us that they understand and accept scientific warnings about climate change, but they are in denial about what this means, what this scientific reality means for policy, or they continue to block progress in less visible ways. And this is the new denialism that is really fundamental to green capitalism. Integral to climate capitalism, new denialism involves talking one way and walking in the opposite direction by obstructing the kinds of changes that could decarbonize our ecological footprint in a timely manner, but that also threaten corporate profits and corporate control of economic decisions. Underpinning the project of climate capitalism is an abiding faith in technology. including emissions reduction and carbon sequestration measures, and in market mechanisms, which fossil capital has largely embraced. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is the poster boy for this stuff, and his incoherent claim that building new bitumen pipelines will actually help fund and fuel a market-based transition from carbon neatly exemplifies the contradictions of this project. So in order to reach lower emissions, we need to actually build new pipelines, is Justin Trudeau's argument. And it's in motion now in Canada, of course. Similarly, Royal Dutch Shell's Sky scenario, released in 2018, cannot be squared with Shell's supposed commitment to the 2015 Paris goals, which were opposed by 94% of its shareholders in 2017. And in a scathing critique, Oil Change International has summarized, I don't have that, I've actually kept the wrong file. Anyway, these things happen. The summary from Oil Change International goes like this in terms of their critique. Massive continuing reliance on fossil fuels, rapid growth in the use of hydrogen fuel, changes in consumer mindsets and energy efficiency practices, net zero deforestation, a mere 10,000 new carbon capture and storage plants around the world, and global carbon pricing mechanisms to encourage carbon capture and storage are hallmarks of Royal Dutch Shell's new scenario for keeping average global warming below 2 degrees between now and 2017. So good luck with that. Nevertheless, climate capitalism is persuasive among elites and many non-elites in the global north, and it's easy to see why. By torquing technology and markets in the direction of renewables, climate capitalism promises to decarbonize the forces of production slowly enough to avoid stranding major assets while preserving the capital-labor relations. It's a scenario of passive revolution, change from above, that leaves the economic nucleus of the historical bloc untouched. Unfortunately, none of the scenarios for climate capitalism has been able to reconcile the contradiction between capital's incessant need to expand and the ecosystem's need for homeostatic equilibrium, which is not something that involves an endlessly expanding ecological footprint for one species. Fortunately, as Laurie Atkin points out, climate capitalism is not the only solution to global warming on offer. Indeed, humanity today is at what she terms a critical crossroads. One road leads to the in the direction of shallow decarbonization, intensifying climate change feedback effects, and worsening global economic security and political instability. This is the path of climate capitalism. Another road leads in the direction of deep decarbonization and shrinking opportunities for capital accumulation, underpinned by new forms of democratic governance. We could call this ecological democracy. Unfortunately, the second road is currently no more than a narrow, poorly signed path, while the first road is a superhighway bedecked with neon and billboards. Now, I mentioned that the owners of 94% of Shell shares voted in 2017 against a motion to align Shell's business plan with the 2015 Paris Accord. Now, it's of no small interest to note that as of April 2018, according to the database Orbis, 78% of Shell's share capital is owned by 10 financial institutions that manage enormous investment funds. Thus, the votes in favor of business as usual at Shell were cast by some of the world's leading managers of financial capital, who are also the leading enablers of fossil capital. Indeed, as Ian Angus has observed, quote, globally, there is more capital invested in oil and gas than in any other industry, end quote. Now, it's really a core industry of global capitalism. If we include state-owned fossil enterprises, total oil and gas capitalization exceeds the value of all the world's banks. These two sectors are at the heart of fossil capitalism. This brings me to an important issue. From Rudolf Hilferding forward, political economists have understood that under monopoly capitalism, there's a close symbiotic relation between big industry and high finance. Industry requires massive outlays of financial capital to fund mega projects and takeovers. Financial institutions need to place the fictitious capital they control in profitable outlets, ideally ventures that offer high and stable rates of return. So they place most of that capital with the big industrial corporations. So you get this symbiosis between big finance and big industry. Now, that brings me to the question of corporate power and the question of mapping corporate power. We can map some of the key relations between fossil capital and financial capital in a network analysis of interlocking directorates. We think about a corporation, how it's organized as a hierarchical entity. Atop each corporate giant, whether industrial or financial, sits the board of directors, a center of power and authority, composed of both capitalists and organic intellectuals who serve in an advisory capacity. The multiple affiliations of directors generate a network of interlocking directors. They sit on each other's boards. And this draws capitalism's leading lights into a socially integrated corporate elite.
So we only have 5 minutes. 5 minutes? 5 minutes.
Okay. So let me, Vish mentioned some of the work that I've done on the making of a transnational capitalist class. Let me give you, in the 5 minutes that remain, a few key findings from research that I've done quite recently. And basically, what I want to share with you is a network analysis of, let me get to the actual network analysis here. This particular network mapping is useful. So let's just think about this and then open things up for discussion. In terms of, this is a mapping of the largest 50 carbon capital corporations. So these are fossil capital and corporations that are primarily invested in oil, gas, and coal, and the 50 largest financial institutions in the world. And the question is, what does it look like when we map out their boards of directors and how the boards interlock? Okay, so each relationship here indicates a board interlock, or in some cases a whole bunch of shared directors. So ExxonMobil and its Canadian subsidiary Imperial Oil, they share like half a dozen directors, and that's a really thick line in the network. But what you can see in the network is a close integration of major financial institutions like Deutsche Bank, or what's another one, Bank of America, and the major fossil capital corporations like Shell and British Petroleum. And so basically what we have is a mapping here of the corporate elite, particular piece of it, right? That's transnational, and that that involves a kind of a social network of solidarity, if you like. We talk about solidarity within the labor movement or movements from below. What I'm making here is that movements from above and the transnational capitalist class also have their solidarity, and this is an important instance of it. Here's Total Petroleum. Interestingly, if I compare this to 10 years ago or so, the Chinese financial institutions in particular have joined this network, this global corporate elite. So that's one of the interesting changes that has taken place in recent years. But let me move fairly quickly to a couple of conclusions, given that time is short. And what I want to conclude with is that, of course, if we look at class formation from below, We also can identify networks of class formation from below. I don't seem to have that slide either. But in any case, some of my research has shown that there is a very interesting transnational network that involves transnational policy, alternative policy groups that pull together different social movements that are committed to change in different respects, in different levels, and so on and so forth. And climate justice activism is a really important part of that class formation from below. There are different political projects involved in this class formation from below, but I think, in a sense, the most significant project that I would call attention to at this point is the project of energy democracy. And by energy democracy, I mean more than just a kind of notion of a just transition that involves retraining workers who were displaced when we shut down a coal mine or something like that, so that they get good jobs elsewhere. That's a very important part of just transition. But energy democracy refers to broader processes. It includes that, but it also includes democratizing the energy economy. And ultimately, this means, since we know from the diagram I showed you, that that there's a close integration of fossil capital and financial capital on a transnational level and, of course, on national levels. It also means democratizing the financial sector. So ultimately, I think when we look toward alternatives to fossil capitalism, we need to think about issues of how to democratize different sectors of the economy and how to grow alternative forms of economic practice, as in solidarity economies. Solidarity economies being made up of socially owned or worker-controlled enterprises and socially controlled, democratically managed financial institutions, and these kinds of alternatives. So I think there are alternatives. I think the alternatives are being advocated. I think we need to, in response to the hegemony of fossil capital, find ways to really grow these alternatives and continue the mass politics and the critical policy analysis that can provide alternative visions, strategies, and practices for building a post-carbon world, which also needs to be, in my view, a post-capitalist world. So maybe on that note, I'll end and we can open things up.
Comments, questions to Bill, and discussion points? Jackie.
Well, thanks very much for a really fascinating presentation and wonderfully clear. And I'm ashamed to ask this question because maybe you deal with it in your book, which I haven't read. But what I'm really interested to know more about is the social content to the interlocking directorships. And I'm wondering if there are, well, what my question comes out of is in the South African context, the golf course has been a very important space in promoting a new power elite in South Africa since 1994, because it provides a point of integration between white and black people on a seemingly neutral, in a neutral space, but which promotes a lot of shared thinking. And I'm wondering if, do they simply have meetings together, or do they drink together, your interlocking directorships? Do they socialize together? What gives it cohesion, apart from simply the fees? Has the interaction got any depth to it?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, Jackie, and I appreciate that. If we look at a national level, there's differences from country to country. So the golf course in post-apartheid South Africa could be a really important meeting place for top capitalists and trying to transcend the racialized differences and so on and so forth. In Canada, for example, private clubs have been very important in the formation of the economic elite. And really, if we think about the economic elite, we're talking about a relatively small number of people that is sort of the leading edge of a much bigger capitalist class. So this would be the analysis. Like the people who are sitting on these corporate boards are a relatively small number of people, actually. But they're actually in control of enormous quantities of capital. If you look on the golf course, you might find some capitalists who are, middle capitalists who don't have enormous assets under their control, but they form part of a broader class. So most of my work has really looked at the top tier of the capitalist class, so-called corporate elite. But you're quite right that there's various forms of social integration that pull them together as the top tier of a ruling class. So the corporate interlocking is an important part because it's directly in the field of business, right? And often we find a lot of interlocks among corporations in which one corporation owns a piece of another corporation, so they appoint people to the board of the other corporation. Or a financial institution maybe has made major loans, these financial enablers. They're sitting on these boards for reasons. It's not just haphazard, right? But when you look at the more informal networking on golf courses or in private clubs, it's a form of building social solidarity and a collective identity. So again, if we think of the bourgeoisie in terms of a movement from above, it's a network that comes together in a number of different ways. It's more than just business. It's located in various places. And we can also look at, for example, policy planning groups, which have, JP and I have done some mapping of policy planning groups and how they connect with corporate boards. So you have, transnationally speaking, you have groups like the Trilateral Commission, or the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And you look at the people who serve on the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, they're a leading advocate of green capitalism, and they are also sitting on these corporate boards. So they're coming together in a different context, a policy planning context, to try to reach a consensus about how we're going to deal with this climate crisis and not threaten our profits, right? So all of this forms part of a very complex assemblage, right? And as Vish was saying, my work really from the 1980s has been to try to map this out, at first in the Canadian context and more recently in the transnational context. But it's a very complex configuration, and the corporate board interlocking is just a piece of the puzzle. Important because it's the actual field of investment and capital decision making.
Michelle and Dinga.
Thanks, Bill. So I'm still struggling with this transnational class formation. So again, I'm trying to figure out, so I get class formation being both structural and agentic and these relations and practices. But then when we take it to the transnational, I get confused on what is structural and what is agentic here. And is agentic simply the fact that we have individuals who are sitting on boards, and is that then class formation? If you could just unpack very concretely, even in this diagram, what makes these things you said transnational, that they exist in national spaces but aren't based in nation state. They cross over to transnational. But is it then their practices, like the corporations' practices that are crossing over, or the agentic? So if you could unpack that for me.
Okay. Bill, can we take one or two more questions? Dinga and Dinga and Nivi and then.
All right, I have two short questions.
Yeah.
The first one is what the analysis of the makeup of this fossil financial transnational capital says about capitalist makeups that are not in the north. From here, I can see the crossing or the incorporation or the moving in of China. Now, what does that say about other, maybe fossil capitalist classes in the global south? And what does that mean about the relations between the north, within the capitalist classes, between the north and the south? So I'm just interested where the mapping to this into, because that has implications for how we've understood imperialism and other big issues.
Yeah.
The second one is about the energy democracy, which you ended your talk on, and the potential of that. And really, I'm interested in what you said about the challenges and the difficulties of class formation from below. And then maybe you can talk more about how energy democracy is the potential and how it overcomes some of the stumbling blocks of class formation from below.
I'll take Vivian and Katiwa, I'll take you in the next round. Is that okay?
Thank you so much. It was very interesting and a very clarifying talk. I was a little intrigued by what you said towards the beginning when you were talking about the three advantages that capital has, right? And I think the first one you talked about, or I might be getting the order wrong, but one of them you talked about how for capital it's a very clearly defined motivation of profit maximization, right? And that gives it an advantage, as opposed to workers where you said the interests have to be politically constructed.
Yeah.
So I just want to pause on that, and I would want you to unpack that a little bit, because to me it seems like it's an advantage that we should be claiming on our side as well. Because the shift of political and economic power from capital to workers is a pretty clear and transparent need and demand. Now, you're of course right, what one does with that power, how one builds a different society in terms of environment and other issues, is of course a political project. But why not say yes to that? Of course that is true, but why give up on the fact that the contradiction between capital and workers is pretty clear-cut and transparent? Because I feel like if we cede that ground, it's not a ground that we need to cede. I mean, because given that environmental degradation is intrinsic to capital, right? And a clear opposition to capital should also be something that we should claim, rather than say this is something we need to construct politically, work everything out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're coming from with it, definitely.
Okay.
So let's take responses to that. So there's actually 4 questions. Michelle, 2 from Dinga, and 1 from Vivian. Then we'll take another round. Get you guys first.
Okay, so Michelle, let me take another stab at this in terms of trying to understand the transnational capitalist class. What is transnational about it, and what is agentic, what is structural? I mean, structurally, we can, in a certain sense, I guess we could think of the structural aspects as the formation of a transnational capitalist class in itself, right? Like basically the transnationalization of investment, transnational corporations, these are transnational practices crossing borders. And it's been going on for decades, and it's a cumulative kind of process. It's slowed down a bit, I think, as Patrick Bond has pointed out, but it's still, foreign investment continues each year. It sort of accumulates. There's more and more capital is invested across borders. Of course, there's still a lot of national investment, so I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which capital has been transnationalized, but I would certainly agree that there is a transnationalization of capital itself. With that transnationalization of capital comes a transnationalization of investment interests. The capitalists are interested in protecting their transnational investments and so on and so forth. And of course that we can trace that back to earlier eras of imperialism, right? So again, it's nothing really new, but there's been a quantitative shift, perhaps, that some people see as a qualitative shift toward a more transnational form of capitalism. But the agentic aspect, in the way I think about it, is sort of has to do with the kinds of things that Jackie and I were talking about in terms of the formation of a global corporate elite that is well organized, that has its own collective capacities to define and elaborate and advocate for a hegemonic project, right? And a hegemonic project that's transnational. So when people, when the World Business Council for Sustainable Development comes up with its green capitalism project, this is a project of the transnational capitalist class. The people who are inventing this project are sitting on these boards of large transnational corporations, and their agency is about more than just short-term profits. They're actually trying to develop a hegemonic project and having some success with that, because after all, national states listen to the World Economic Forum and they participate in it for that matter. It's a kind of it's a watering hole for not just economic elites but political elites, and so I think this is what I think I would suggest in terms of thinking about the transnational dimensions in this. But it's a really good question that that I struggle with as well, because I think sometimes there's some analyses that sort of overestimate, I think, the extent to which capitalism has become transnational, the extent to which the capitalist class is now somehow detached from national capital interests, or national economic interests, national economies. Because there is still, if you look at the way world capitalism functions, there's both the national and the transnational. It's not like there used to be the national, now it's a transnational. Most capitalists, of course, and virtually 99% of them, are not transnational capitalists, right? Their investments are more local. They're not, giant kind of corporations, right? So if we're talking about the capitalist class as an entity that's much more than just a transnational corporate elite, right? Most of that capitalist class is embedded within national states, national economies. But it's obviously important to focus on the transnational, that small segment that's very powerful because of the degree to which capital is concentrated and the degree to which transnational corporations really do function in a transnational field of accumulation. I don't know if that helps, but I mean that's the way I'm thinking about it. That there is a dialectic of agency and structure at work here, and there is it's more than just a blind structural process. There's always human agency involved, right, in economic and political decision making, and we can in this kind of analysis that JP and I do. It's a limited analysis. I don't want to claim that it's some sort of silver bullet that really gives us some sort of perspective on the world that's the reality that's somehow deeper than what we might learn using other methodologies and so on. But it's a useful way of sort of focusing in this case on the transnational, the top tier of the transnational capitalist class, and looking at how it's structured and what the political implications of that might be, and how being structured in a certain way, certain forms of agency are also enabled by that structure. Now, what about the global south and the question of relations between the north and south within capitalist class, or within the capitalist class? And I guess what comes to mind is the BRICS, and the question of, well, how do the BRICS fit into this kind of structure? As you can see, China, is, I think, more integrated into these transnational elite networks. Not China, I'm sort of reifying China here. I don't mean China as a kind of entity, but certain Chinese capitalists sit on the boards of major corporations that are based in the global north. And that's a new phenomenon. When I looked at this kind of network a decade or so ago, these connections into Chinese financial institutions simply weren't there. So there is a process of elite integration taking place, and it's important to point out that, of course, China is in some ways unique among the global, the countries of the global South. It is, after all, the world's first or second largest economy. It's the four of the Chinese, the green squares here. 4 of those green squares represent the 4 largest banks in the world. They're all based in China. And China is a very powerful financial and industrial force in the world, as we know. Now, China is a state capitalist formation, in my view. It's different in some respects from Britain or the United States and so on. And it doesn't occupy quite the same position as the classic imperialist powers, right? But in my view, it's on a trajectory toward full-fledged imperialism. But there's also really important differences between China and the other capitalist powers. After all, in China, the Communist Party is the leading political force. Now, it's not a Communist Party that's dedicated to revolutionary socialism, but it's an entity, it's a structure, if you like, that is very powerful within Chinese state capitalism. So the actual directors of these Chinese banks are integrated into the Chinese state. Like they're not private capitalist investors by and large, although that also exists in China. But a number of the most of the major Chinese corporations are state-owned enterprises, and their directors are also basically state managers in a certain sense. So they are pursuing what they take to be a national interest of China, and that's a bit of a different project from the projects of let's say Morgan Stanley or Deutsche Bank or whatever. So there is, I think, when we look at China compared to the classic imperialist powers, there is a difference there, but there's also a tendency toward integration. China has its own accumulation strategy, in terms of trying to develop, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, the infrastructure that will put it closer to the center of global commodity chains, because it is engaged in a kind of interesting love-hate relationship with U.S. capitalism. On the one hand, China largely funds the American state, in terms of allowing it to continue to run deficits and continuously enlarge its military machine. A lot of that funding indirectly by buying all those treasury bills comes from China. These Chinese banks are invested in American imperialism. But on the other hand, China, and of course China exports a lot to the United States. Now the trade war has really erupted between China and the United States. It's a very complex, conflictual, and yet also deep structural relationship between Chinese capitalism and American capitalism. But as I say, at the same time, China is trying to compete and develop its own access to resources in Africa and other places. So it's engaging in its own imperialist practices in the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to develop a kind of basis for its own capital accumulation, not just within China, but very much on a more transnational basis. So the reason I'm focusing on China is because it is, I think, a bit of an exception among the so-called BRICS. And I think the category of BRICS is an interesting kind of social invention. If you look back to it, it's not a theoretical category at all. It's a category, it's what Marx would call a chaotic conception. It doesn't really exist except in a kind of discourse that some business analyst came up with a few years ago and said, hey, let's call this BRICS. These countries, they're high-growth global South countries, and they all seem to have something in common. But I think social scientifically we have to be more careful about that. On the other hand, given the social construction of reality, BRICS is now a thing, right? You know, there's the BRICS Business Council, there's the BRICS this and the BRICS that. There are actual meetings of BRICS. So in a certain sense, the BRICS has come into existence, but it's not necessarily in political economic terms something that really holds together, is to say, oh, the BRICS, they actually constitute a homogeneous category in global political economy. So, you know, the question about relations between the global north and the global south within the capitalist class is, I think, a very interesting one that you're raising. My research generally shows that the transnational capitalist class, if we focus on this corporate elite and the actual relationships, social networks that pull people together, that it's primarily, it's almost overwhelmingly a northern formation. In fact, we can be even more specific, it's a Euro-North American formation. But we can see the Chinese banks starting to enter into this formation. So it's not as if it's a static reality. You know, obviously, you know, things are changing. But I would say there's, the pattern has been overwhelming predominance of northern-based capital, northern-based capitalists in these global corporate elite networks. And the global south is largely shut out of that process. Of course, you know, from a kind of critical left perspective, I don't think anybody should be aspiring to join the transnational capitalist class. So, you know, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that the global south is not part of it is something we can talk about. But in any case, the other question that was being raised about energy democracy, that's, you know, I mean, I think that energy democracy is, as I've tried to suggest, an important concept in combining those two terms, energy and democracy, so that we can think about energy as something that's fundamental to human existence, and how can we democratize the production, distribution, consumption of energy. How can we move from fossil energy system to a post-carbon energy system? And the important point in that kind of energy transition is the question of democracy. How can the energy system be democratized? How does this overcome blocks in class formation from below? I don't think it does in any really dramatic way. It's just, it's part of a broader project, in my view, that really we're talking about what I would call a kind of democratic eco-socialism. And so it's more than just energy democracy, but energy democracy helps focus on the problem of fossil capital and the undemocratic character of fossil capital, that it needs to be, you know, engaged and critiqued and transformed. So that, I think, is the political and discursive value of this term, energy democracy. But as I say, I think it's something that needs to be broadened beyond the initial conception of energy democracy, which was basically about retraining displaced workers and making sure that they could have good jobs elsewhere. That's fundamental, but it's not, in my view, to democratize the energy system is more than just, you know, helping workers find jobs if they're displaced from decarbonization. Then in terms of capital's advantages, you know, was sort of my starting point in this talk. Yeah, I mentioned the transparency of motive. This comes out of an essay by Offe and Weisenthal that was published years back in the 1980s on two logics of collective action, which I found very interesting in, you know, dealing with sort of class formation from above and below. And they really took on this question of the logic involved in capital compared to the struggles for labor to try to come together. Labor can only really pursue its interests through association, whereas capitalists pursue their interests through a transparent profit motive, and they accumulate capital and it's liquid, and it's a whole different kind of logic that they're engaged in. why not emphasize the contradiction between capital and labor? Well, I think precisely we need to emphasize that contradiction. But maybe where I would disagree with you is on the question of how transparent it is, because I think it's not. I think the thing about capitalism, and this goes back to sort of classical Marxism, is that the capital-labor contradiction is at the center of this mode of production, and yet the ideology that sustains the mode of production, liberal ideology, bourgeois ideology, precisely denies that contradiction, and it's a fairly persuasive ideology unless working class people, unless labor actually does become organized and recognize that it has a collective interest different from simply earning money and spending money, simply participating in bourgeois society as individuals. And so bourgeois ideology tends to emphasize the idea of possessive individualism, right? We're each just individuals, and we have freedom of choice. We have equality of opportunity in the marketplace. If we don't accumulate vast wealth, well, it's because we made the wrong decisions in life. This kind of bourgeois ideology is very persuasive to a lot of people. So I don't know. Capital-labor contradiction. It could be that I think South Africa has had a much stronger socialist and labor tradition going back to the ANC and the Communist Party and the Triple Alliance and everything, the struggle against apartheid, and Winnie Mandela, as a militant, we're celebrating her life today. If I compare this situation to, say, Canada, which is much more in the grip of the kind of snapshot analysis I gave you through Matthew Huber, this notion of suburbanized life, everybody owns a car and has a house or aspires to, this kind of idea of the abstract individual making their own choices. That's much more the terrain of North American capitalism, and the capital-labor contradiction, it needs to be politically constructed, if you like. I mean, it exists, obviously, but in people's minds, I'm not so sure that...
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, then it's fine, because, of course, it has to be constructed, it has to be built, people have to be organized,
Absolutely.
all of that. Obviously, in that sense, it's not transparent. But I thought you were talking at the level of where the interests are contradictory, and that in one sense, capital's interests are clear, but workers' interests are not that clear. It is something that we need to build. So I was taking issue with the latter part, but not with the organizing thing, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Katiwe first. We'll take the last round. Alex, anybody else, and Patrick, and then yourself. And you end up, please. Katiwe, you first.
I'm Janet.
Janet, sorry.
Okay, thanks. I think actually she has probably maybe addressed some of the things that I wanted to raise. But thanks so much at least for perhaps providing a clear distinction between the social movement from below and from above. Because I was trying to grapple with it the moment I got in, but I think you managed to perhaps unpack it further. But as for me, I'm just trying to also perhaps, I'm just wondering as to whether we should really, is this the conventional meaning of social movements? The manner in which you're addressing these kind of movements, the one from below and from above. I'm still trying to grapple as to how we should we rethink the concept of social movement. In its sort of like primary form, or is this another kind of social movement? I'm not. It's just something that I would want to hear more. But also, I'm still perhaps grappling with the fact that when you mentioned here, you gave some examples around capitalism in its attempt to establish its social movement from above and alliances. You actually gave an example of neoliberal feminist is perhaps being part and parcel of that particular WhatsApp group of capitalism. And I'm actually grappling with the concept of neoliberal feminism itself and feminism in itself, perhaps the heterogeneous kind of it. Like for instance, perhaps does it mean that feminism, perhaps in the northern global north, is completely detached from the interests of the feminist movement in the global south, given the fact that the countries that are actually affected more by these extractive industries and the extractive companies like BP Shell and whatever are located within the global south. Yet we hear one part of the feminist movement is actually forming alliances with social movement from above, which is more aligned to capitalism. Perhaps if you could unpack further on that particular angle. Okay, let me
Alex, and
thanks.
then Patrick.
I would like to ask Bill if this slowing of global interconnection that I feel in FDI, foreign direct investment rates of profit on foreign direct investment, cross-border financial flows, even as internally debt ratios rise, the shipping industry's crisis, the Baltic dry index went from 12,000 at peak to 300, it's in the 800 range now. These are all since 2007. McKinsey Global Flows can give you this. This is deglobalization, is it? This is a phrase that's being used by leftists from Walden Bellow in Asia, Samir Amin. And if so, if the globalization of people can continue, and we can slow the globalization of capital, if it's doing it intrinsically because of its own overaccumulation crises, barriers to the spatial fix, then the work you're doing might be more important. It's emblematized today by the crash of Saga Marta, which is the big media platform. It was linking India and South Africa. And, tomorrow was its JSE debut, but it was cancelled yesterday because complete fake route, right? People involved in it are kind of notorious scammers. One of them, Paul Survey, is the head of the BRICS Business Council. Actually, they're widely despised by white monopoly capital, so it's a sort of extension of the ZUP to WMC level. So does that make any difference? There's globalization of people underway, migrancy, the kind of meeting that has you coming here. But do corporate elites also follow the flows of capital? If those, like the 1930s or 1870s and 80s, go into reverse because of a deep capitalist crisis, so globalization grounds down, trade wars break out, maybe a World War III if John Bolton has his way. I don't know if you're putting a temporality into this or thinking of earlier historical epochs of deglobalization, but we need to talk about this now. There's still so much rhetoric about being globally competitive, making South Africa, sort of an export-oriented country to solve the foreign debt, the balance of payments, current account deficits. And if we can recognize deglobalization, maybe your interlocking directorates and the fossil fuel kind of projects that see big slowdowns in mega projects and the Durban ports kind of cancelled at the moment, things like that, that leave me rather more encouraged. I don't know if you have the same sentiment.
And Alex?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm also very interested in the question of class formation. We do it quite differently, I think, and this is where my questions come from. So, first of all, about your last point about liberalism being this sort of ideology, capitalism covering up the contradiction between capital and labor, I'm a bit worried about that as a blanket statement. And the reason is, well, historically speaking, wasn't, say, welfarist capitalism in northern and western Europe after the Second World War some sort of capitalist acknowledgement of this contradiction existing and then regulating it to a certain degree, or if you want to use Gramscian terms, create a passive revolution where it could be controlled rather than suppressing it. But you can obviously also look at other regions of the world and other eras where liberalism wasn't the dominant ideology, but we would still call them capitalist. The second point is, I was wondering about the capitalist state. What is the role of the capitalist state in all of this? And in a certain way, I think it's crucial, not just because it seems to be very difficult to understand the rivalries in different blocks that you also talked about in terms of imperialism, but also because that possibly implies there are certain obstacles to the formation of transnational capitalist classes. Maybe we're still dealing with different capitalist classes belonging to different blocks. But also because at least if we have some sort of parliamentary or other forms of democratic decision-making, that may sort of create obstacles also for capitalist class formation in the way you describe it. And then the third point is about class formation from below. And I got the sense that you're saying, well, it's impossible to break with growth if you don't break with capitalism. And I think I agree with that. I don't have a problem with it. But if you turn it on its head, it may be possible to break with capitalism without breaking with growth. And the reason why I say this is this abysmal record of state socialism in Eastern Europe in terms of taking into consideration ecological issues. And also because there may be forms of class formation from below where ecological questions are marginal and don't play a role. And how do you deal with these contradictions? If workers say, yeah, we want to overthrow capitalism, we want to go against capitalist class domination, but obviously we need industries and we need jobs and so forth, so the whole green agenda doesn't matter so much to us.
Thanks. Lisa, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, just a small question. It was quite a small section at the end about the solidarity economies, which I'm not sure I really can think of any examples that come to mind. Could you perhaps provide some that inspire you?
Well, these are great questions. So the question of movements from above and below and neoliberal feminism, and the whole question of feminism is a really important one. This notion of neoliberal feminism comes out of the work of feminists like Nancy Fraser, right? And it's basically a socialist feminist critique of the trajectory of a certain strand of feminism that becomes, in a certain sense, hegemonic after the decline of the New Left and so on and so forth, and the real, development of neoliberalism as a hegemonic project. So, we can think of neoliberal feminists. I suppose the iconic neoliberal feminist is Hillary Clinton, right? So she's a feminist of the North. She's totally identified with capitalism. She believes in the empowerment of women as an abstract kind of claim, right? But she also believes in markets and capitalism and the whole 9 yards of that. But I think that is, I was using it really just as an example of how capitalism can, is flexible. Like its hegemonic block of alliances can shift over time. It does shift over time. We need to pay attention to that as part of class formation from above. So that's all I meant in terms of how neoliberal feminism, how capitalism can shift from a kind of commitment to a patriarchal nuclear family to a commitment to the dual income neoliberal feminist configuration. We can see that happening. It's very uneven. It's not as if it's happening everywhere in the world, but certainly in North America, this is one of the developments. But as I say, I mean, feminism is a many-splendored thing, right? And I've certainly identified as a socialist feminist since the 1970s. But it's not the dominant stream of feminism, right? It's always on the, it's always critiquing the dominant stream, right? And this is what Nancy Fraser tends to do. But I think if we look at feminism in the global South, probably neoliberal feminism is a less persuasive current. Maybe we could have a conversation about this. I don't know. I know one of the groups that I worked with closely in developing my analysis of transnational alternative policy groups is a group called DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, is what it stands for as an acronym. And that's a really good example of a left, southern-based feminist project, that's taking on issues of inequality in the global political economy, that's taking on local issues in the global South in terms of the position of women, but not through this lens of neoliberal feminism. It's not about trying to make sure that women become as competitive in the market as men. It's much more about broader social transformations and gender justice is the way they would frame their analysis. So, in class formation from above and from below, you can sort of see as class formation from above tends to co-opt neoliberal feminism or co-opt feminism into neoliberalism, right? And it becomes neoliberal feminism. Class formation from below, in my view, needs to really develop socialist feminism and make it a central part of the counter-hegemonic bloc. And groups like DAWN are involved in those kinds of processes. But obviously it's a difficult process. Now, Patrick asked a question about deglobalization, and I think, Walden Bellow, one of the key people thinking about deglobalization from below, if you like. This was his project that focused on the global South, and the idea was that that if we can pull back from globalized capitalism, we can reclaim the social power that gets alienated into these global corporate elites and boardrooms and so on. We can actually bring it down to local levels and national parliaments and so on and so forth, and develop a more democratic world through deglobalization. I think the pattern has been, certainly, transnationalization and globalization. We all know that. I think what you're pointing to is how in our current post-2008 conjuncture, there are some major kinds of questions with that kind of narrative of endless globalization, right, of the transnational capitalist class. And I agree with you. I think the statistics, what they show, and I think this is what you were saying basically, is a slowing down. It's a slowing down of capitalist globalization. But I think that's different from deglobalization. So I think capitalism is still globalizing in various ways. I don't think we're in an era of deglobalization at all. But if there's another financial crash, if these trade wars really get underway, who knows? I think the future is yet to be made. It's a matter of what people do. That's how the future gets made. So, a scenario of inter-imperialist rivalry and pulling back from globalization is entirely feasible in my view. There's no kind of DNA in capitalism that says, well, it has to be always globalizing and so on and so forth. No, it's a complex question in terms of the relationship between national states and capital accumulation. And certainly national states haven't gone away. National states are an important part of the global political economy. So, in a sense, I think we can see in global capitalism today a kind of debate perhaps taking place between the Donald Trump side of economic nationalism and the World Economic Forum side. And I had a slide of Donald Trump at the World Economic Forum, right? And that's a very interesting scenario, right? Trying to accommodate him and integrate him into the project, as best they can, right? Because we have the project of capitalist global governance, which has been the hegemonic project for some time now. But we also have precisely because of the ongoing crisis of global capitalism, we have this rise of economic nationalism, and I think, the question of trade wars, and as you mentioned, maybe even military wars, we'll see what happens, right? Like it's a very unstable conjuncture that we're in right now. So I would not be willing to make predictions, but in a sense, when we do this analysis, which is very current analysis, it's still sort of reading tea leaves from the past, right, in terms of where things are going. Like we can't, as social scientists, we can never do anything more than historical analysis, even if it's recent history, right? But I think you're right, there is that kind of tension between inter-imperialist rivalry and the continuation of global governance regimes, which has been like the Barack Obama kind of model or whatever, taking it back decades now. And part of it is, of course, symptomatic of a decline of American hegemony, right? The Trump phenomenon is very much a kind of emblematic of that decline of American hegemony and the attempt to regain economic dominance, political dominance in the world. We saw this a bit with Ronald Reagan, by the way, so it's not as if it's never happened in the past. So you don't have to go back all the way to World War I to see it. You can see that Ronald Reagan was a bit of an economic nationalist at the same time that he was a globalizing kind of capitalist leader and political leader. So I don't know. That's my sort of attempt to respond to your question. But we can talk later on as well. The question of liberalism and liberal ideology is a really good one. Certainly, if we look at things from the perspective of capitalism as a world system, you're absolutely right that liberalism has not been hegemonic everywhere all the time, by any means. Liberalism is the ideology of the core of capitalism, right? And, like, for example, in apartheid South Africa, I don't think liberalism was the dominant ideology. It was a racialized kind of ideology, right? And liberalism wouldn't work so well in an apartheid system. So it would have to be somewhat of a different ideological framework to try to legitimate, such an obviously unjust arrangement. But you're right that welfare capitalism, particularly in Northern Europe, think about Sweden, advanced welfare states, was a politics of class compromise, and it's still intact. It's not as if it's gone away. I mean, it's still Sweden still has many of the institutions of welfare capitalism, for example. Or even a fairly neoliberalized country like Canada, we can still point to aspects of class compromise and welfare capitalism. So I think that's a good point, but I think it actually validates the point I was making, which is that the interests of labor have to be politically constructed. That's exactly what happened in the post-war period. And they were constructed within social democratic parties, and they became strong enough to push forward an agenda of reform that led to these welfare states, right? So, but that all depended on a political construction of the interests of labor in trying to humanize, trying to give capitalism a human face and somehow meet the needs of workers while also meeting the accumulation needs of capitalism. It's a framework that worked in the global north for a few decades. It was a framework, I think, in some respects, of passive revolution. It didn't lead to any socialist transformation in any particular place, but it did offer the working class a certain kind of collective capacity within national capitalist states. So, in that case, I think, I guess my side remark about liberalism was not an attempt to sort of provide an overall analysis of ideology, but just to say that, within capitalism, liberal ideology is a kind of touchstone in this mode of production. If you have a capitalist system in which markets are really, it's a market society. Liberal ideology gets traction under those conditions. I would continue to defend that claim, but I agree that it's, when we look concretely at different social formations, we can't just say, well, liberal ideology is everywhere and it's dominant and so on. Much more complicated than that. Similarly with the state, very complicated, and I think your insight is exactly correct in terms of the obstacles to the full development of a transnational capitalist class. Like I've actually engaged in some debate with the leading protagonist of this idea of the transnational capitalist class in itself. That would be William Robinson. And he seems to think that capitalism has become so globalized that we now have a transnational capitalist class aware of its interests, able to act on its collective interests in ruling the world as a global capitalist formation. And I disagree with that. I think it's much more complicated, and one of the key obstacles is, as you say, national states. The global political economy is still divided into national states. Despite the the G20 meetings or whatever, the United Nations, various institutions that try to provide some global governance and frameworks. Nonetheless, capitalism is a mode of production that is distributed, into these different national states, and there's political power exercised within each national state, and that means that capitalists who are operating within these national states don't necessarily recognize their project as the same as the project of transnational capitalism writ large. So I think the state is a crucial element in all of this. In my own research, I've focused on the global corporate elite, but that's not to say that the state, state and political power is irrelevant. It's just a fact of life that in social science we can't study everything all at once. I think you also asked a question of class formation from below and the question of growth. Is that? And the legacy of the failure of socialism in Eastern Europe, which seemed to be a project of breaking with capitalism but not with growth. And I think that's really interesting to think about. And I think what it points to is precisely the challenge we face politically today, which is to combine the green agenda with the socialist agenda, and that certainly didn't happen in Eastern Europe. But I think both of those agendas need to be framed within democratic transitions, more democratic ways of life, participatory democracy in various areas, and decentralization of political power. There's a whole number of aspects of this. But I think the question of growth is an important one, and the one point I would make in this regard that I also made earlier today in our seminar is that growth is a very ideological term in itself. It is part of bourgeois ideology, this notion of growth, right? Because what growth really encodes is capital accumulation. So if we want to break with capitalism, we need to actually break with the discourse of growth. And one way that middle-class environmentalists tried to do that and continue is through this concept of degrowth. We want to break with growth. How we do that is we degrow. In my view, that doesn't work so well. I think we actually need to refuse the binary of growth versus degrowth. Because growth, we need to really unpack what growth means. We need to deconstruct it and recognize that growth means capital accumulation. So what we want is not degrowth, but what we want is a whole different paradigm for our futures, our common future. And that is, taking this from John Beverly Foster, that's the notion of sustainable human development. So I think we need to develop a different discourse, and with that political project, right, of democratic eco-socialism. And I think with regard to the question of growth, refuse that discourse and instead develop ideas around sustainable human development. And what that means, it connects with ideas such as the Andean socialist notion of buen vivir, living well rather than having more. And living well doesn't mean accumulating commodities that you surround yourself with and identify with as the basis of your being in the world. It means developing rich social relations. Of course, there are material needs that will always have to be met, and so on and so forth. And we need to continue to develop the forces of production, in my view. But we need a view of the forces of production that is an ecological view of the forces of production. Forces of production in our time, so the cutting edge of forces of production, I think, are precisely ecological initiatives to shrink our footprint. That doesn't mean living in a way that somehow human needs aren't met. In fact, it opens the door to a richer way of life, right? But not through growth, aka capital accumulation. So that would be my response to the question. And of course, in Eastern Europe, none of that took place. It was, as you say, a totally ground form of state socialism. It wasn't a democratic form of socialism either. So there are a lot of problems with those projects that led to their failure. But I think climate justice politics is precisely that kind of, combination of the politics of socialism. I mean, this is the promise, in my view, of climate justice politics, to pull in that collective project of socialism, social justice, and connect it organically to the question of an ecological way of life, a sustainable human development. And Lisa's question about solidarity economies, can I name some? Well, I would refer you to Michelle Williams and Vish. Both of these people are really experts in the question of solidarity economies. It really doesn't refer to one thing in my understanding. It refers to a whole range of economic arrangements that break from the logic of capital in terms of this kind of large corporations and endless accumulation, and instead direct us toward sustainability ecologically, meeting human needs. These formations, they can be worker co-ops, community enterprises, various forms of economic organization that break from the standard kind of business as usual corporate capital form. So that's what I have in mind in terms of solidarity economies. And on a hopeful note, there's a lot of examples of that. It is happening. It's not an abstract kind of pie in the sky thing. We can actually see these alternatives to capitalism on small scales. And the question is how to scale up and how to develop effective networks that connect these together. That's it.
So, this was a Marxist attempt to explain the climate crisis, which is with us and which is going to get worse. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank our sponsors, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. And a big round of applause for them.